we plan for after lunch, and the after lunch is a symposium when other people will come, and I get to talk again. But first thing after lunch, what I'd like you to do is to pair up with someone else, and as you work in your pairs, actually think of yourselves as a foursome. There are two humans and two non-humans, and the non-human isn't materialised in the room, but one of the humans knows their object very well. And so what I want you to do is to introduce your object to the other person as a participant in your collective. Okay, so I won't say more now, I'll say a little bit more when we finish. But so thinking of your object as a participant in a collective, introduce it to another person. Be prepared to. But now let's have a look at the reading. So for today I set this very short text by Jonathan Swift on the difficulty of talking with objects, which is part of Gulliver's Travels, which is thought of as the most, well, as the highlight, I suppose, of Jonathan Swift's career. And so,
does anybody not have a copy?
So the questions, which are on the next slide, that I suggested you might think about when you're reading this. Okay. Can we have the questions, Jerry, on the next slide?
No, sorry.
Okay, we're locating. Okay, remember that I'm thinking of this text as a participant, okay, not as a representation. Okay, we're already sort of doing what we're doing. So the text is a participant, and it first came to life as a participant in England nearly 300 years ago. So I ask you to think about how this text might have worked as a participant in that context. And secondly, why, and this is why I gave it to you in its full form, why did it appear as almost in this huge catalogue for an exhibition put together by Bruno Latour called Making Things Public. Why did the collective out of which that exhibition grew, why did they put this text both in the exhibition and as the second text in this huge book? It's a great fat book about this fact. Clearly it was working as a participant in both those very different collectives. So if we have the next slide, we see Jonathan Swift, a lugubrious looking Anglo-Irishman. And
can I interrupt with a tiny story?
Sure.
Our family had a fog watch that somehow got handed down that had, when you open it up, it had his face etched in It was Jonathan Swift's watch. God knows how, anyway.
Wow.
But, yeah.
Wow.
There you go.
Where is it now?
It was sold off in at a moment of poverty to Sotheby's, I think, or something like that. Yeah, I didn't ever know what happened to it. I only ever saw it once as this very special
Family
like it was a
object.
really big occasion to actually get it out of its box and open it up and see that. I can't remember that face particularly, but there was
Probably
a face.
was the one with the curly hair.
One of them,
Yeah.
on his better hair.
Yes. Or his wig day. Yes. Yes. So in the 17th century, he was Anglo-Irish. So part of the very beginnings of the British Empire, and he was known for his satire, which is generally understood as clever and humorous critique. Okay, so this is critique. Now, critique goes along with being modern, and so, of course, in a way, Jonathan Swift is a member of our tribe. We're still doing. We're in the same sort of job that he was in. Okay? So he's one of our ancestors, you might say. And so this notion of critique goes very much along with modernity and the emergence of modernity, and critique involves this notion of criticising some form of behaviour, collective or individual, with the idea of generating improvement. In other words, its critique implies this notion of someone who's able to stand outside the current situation and to see it differently and to write, in this case, in an exaggerated or ironic way. So this is very tied up with all the study of rhetoric and the different sorts of texts that have life. And I mean, one of the reasons we talk about different genres and different registers for texts is because we're recognising them as participants. I mean, that's what that's doing, recognising texts as participants. So the text, I said, is ironic, exaggerated. It's written with the aim of improving something, and it's perhaps a more entertaining and a slightly better written version of the text that I would aspire to write. So it's the text too is an ancestor of texts that go under my name, have my name on the byline. Okay, and so what I want to do now is very soon open it up for you to talk about the text and what you think, what you thought in response to the answers. Maybe we go back to the question slide. What you thought, if you thought in response to those questions. But I'll just say that one of the things that Bruno Latour is promoting, or one of the ideas of a fairly recent paper of his, is the idea that critique has run out of steam. So this idea that somehow critique is past its use-by date. That's, I think, one of the reasons that we need to talk about objects of governance here and now. So since I didn't put anything by Bruno Latour, Bruno Latour was the person he was one of the curators of this huge exhibition in Germany called Making Things Public, and he's the editor of the book and a sort of famous French philosopher.
Another question. Do you think that when Latour was saying that critique is run on esteem, was he talking about the texts, or was he talking about art as critique?
Talking about the texts
or as visual arts as a critique, a form of critique. Do you know?
I think he's really thinking about critique as, if you like, a process that legitimates the idea of objective knowledge production. Does that make sense to you? I mean, I think you can think about it in this wider way, but yes, it brings up this whole question of critique, and the Swift article really is, it's obviously critique, which is one of the reasons I set it, because this question of critique running out of steam, we'll talk a bit about it on day 3 more. That's a good question. Okay, so we just have a look at the little text, and so we'll open it up.
Well, my first comment is there was a lot of crazy, not that I've read a lot of it, but the little bits that I have read in that period, like Alexander's Pope, and there's a lot of crazy writing there. That I don't know whether it was people were always thinking crazy thoughts and they finally had the opportunity to put them on paper and have them mass reproduced, or whether or not it was a crazy time. But this seems to me to fit into that sort of genre, to use the word again.
So this idea of pamphlets, and Swift wrote a lot of pamphlets that circulated. So it's really the beginning of texts being recognised as participants and texts coming to life as, you know, ordinary and everyday participants in discussion.
And so also sort of contemporaneous with that sort of Scottish Enlightenment sort of thinking, Hume and whoever else they are, talking about, you know, what does it mean for us to be citizens and things like that. So there was that sort of, you know, the moral philosophy and the serious talk that went along with it, and then this other field of people who were playing in a much different kind of way, but presumably in the same kind of, you know, knowledge makers, different kinds of knowledge makers doing their work in different kinds of ways, and this much more sort of imaginative and ironic way in which you spoke.
Yeah, and remember they're an elite, you know, they're a tiny elite, and they more or less all know each other. They're related to each other very often.
Swift was a priest, wasn't he? Like a dean of the cathedral or something. And I think some of the people that he was angry at were some of these other sort of the rationalist type. And I think it seems to me when he's writing it, he's really annoyed about something. And he's annoyed about the presumption of the rationalists, the side of the rationalists, that you can actually do away with all the beauty of language and religion, art and or whatever, and just chop all the words up so they're only one syllable each, and then get rid of all the verbs and adjectives because it's basically nouns, and then let's get rid of the words altogether, let's just have objects. And you know, perfectly good-looking system until the women come along and object to the fact that they're doing it because you know what women are like. They're just such traditionalists and they want to do things the way that their ancestors have done. So it seems like he's annoyed at the rationality that seems to be sweeping all around him and saying you actually take it to its extreme. going to look like this, and it might work in the house, it might work even out on the street, but it's certainly not going to work in institutions of learning, where you've got learning people that need bags that are so big that you're going to have to set up huge institutions full of stuff so that they can have their conversation.
Point in a sense that those two things emerge at the same time. So there's the rationalists who are seeking to do their work towards their own ends, and he's in railing against that. It's all part of that whole thing emerging, which is the question about what are we all doing here and how do we need to do it. So yeah, they're sort of both effects of the same, some kind of change that's going on at the time, which might have been to do with how the world, the British were going out to take over the world or whatever it was they were doing at the time. But so big social distance emerging and connection with other cultures and words and ways of doing things. It must have been quite a challenge to the England of even only 100 years before, when that stuff wasn't happening.
When in history did the period that we now call reductionism, like modernism and that,
Bacon, and this is 1826, 1726, and Bacon was like 50 years before, and his, great instauration, or his Francis Bacon had this idea of that science, that scientific method could replace God making the world. So Bacon had this plan of writing 6 volumes, which would be equivalent to God's work on each day, and so this is like 50 or 60 years later. Parliamentary life is established, so it's really getting going. Really.
So could it have been partly a reaction to that reductionist, the idea that life could be reduced down to mechanism?
Yeah, and you're getting very strongly this idea that there's a world out there and that there's words over here, and they're separate. And Swift, it seems to me, is really making us wonder if words and things are they separate? The words move around up here and things move around down here, or are words things? Does have a different mode.
He still says that they're separate because he says words are names for things. So he's still separating the name from the thing, but he's discounting all other kinds of words.
But don't you think he's being ironic?
That's what the professors are doing. Yeah,
I get that. But I just think it's interesting he's dropped out all of the in-between, all the verbs or the qualifying things, and sort of concentrating on the very concrete, or less of the things.
It's as if things are, yes.
That's what's important, it's the concrete.
And then there's that nice sort of revenge of the things when it turns out that just by having all these objects, and then they end up being physically weighed down by them, the political agency of those objects and the relationship between those objects all together on the backs of these people sort of reasserts how you need that language for describing relationships.
What useful things words are.
Yeah.
And also the idea that the reason why the professors thought of it in the first place is to save people's lungs, because lungs are really given a hard time when people talk. So if we just stop talking and just use instruments, there's health benefits as well. So there are health benefits, but also just convenience of being able to use the objects.
So I sometimes watch technical people trying to communicate and getting very irritated that the person they're communicating with does not understand the very precise thing that this term is naming. So this, do you think there's still a bit of this around?
Absolutely.
Well, when he says that you have the problem of the big institutions with all the stuff in there that you need to make a conversation, but the advantage is that there's no language barriers. If we do it properly, there's no language barriers at all, and different people from all over the place can come along because they don't use language, they can understand each other perfectly.
Yes.
So the solution to the problem of two scientists getting cross with each other is just to invent another instrument or another object to talk with so that they don't need the language that they get frustrated over.
Yes.
A universal language in all civilised nations. But it talks also about short conversations for the house. So the house is not a place where you have long conversations and need lots of things. So is there a re-inscribing of the idea that the home isn't a place, or that the house isn't a place for complexity? Or not?
Complexity, unspeakable complexity or unknowable complexity, perhaps. Yes.
Is it also sorry.
Gemma.
I guess as well it's inappropriate technology, so, you know, as Britain was expanding, they tried to apply technology that was okay in England to other places, like, you know, in Australia, there's loads of grass everywhere, and grass is stupid for Australia because, you know, in the dry season it's brown, in the wet season it's just boggy, like, so it's brilliant in England, but it's just stupid in Australia, and, like, you know, people wearing lots of English clothes, so there's all these things that are just inappropriate that were just taken from one place and dumped in another, and there was no real appreciation. There was like an arrogance to like the local knowledge, and so instead of just going somewhere and saying, okay, these people have been here a long time, let's learn how they do things, there's like, right, okay, they're stupid, they don't know, but we've got to make them understand us, so they invent a completely ridiculous technology and just sort of force it upon people, and it sort of pleases no one because no one can communicate. It's sort of, although it's, you know, neither language,
It's neither language, it's neither your thing nor my thing, nor my word nor your word.
yeah.
So do you think there's still a fair bit of that happening? And if we were a bit more canny about the way material things and wordy things mix up, we might be better off in getting good technologies.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's habit as well. Like, you know, Australia doesn't have siestas because come from English. So, like, you know, that old saying, you know, English dogs are madmen and they're dogs. So we're out in the midday sun, and like, so locals, I don't know, no one goes out in the midday sun except like we're determined to like keep that English sort of 9 to 5 sort of thing going on, and like there's a lot of things that are just habit that have transferred over, but yeah, so I guess a lot of that, and so it's, language is a technology, I guess.
And things are technology.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, we can actually think of technologies as being social and physical and material and mixed up together in very profound ways. So I think technology can be a useful term if you, I mean, as Andrea suggested, that objects of governance are bossy bits. You might like to think of a phrase that has technology in it.
I guess there's lots of examples, like, you know, people will go to a country and they're like, right, there's no education, so, and if you go to sort of somewhere like Cambodia, there's a whole load of school buildings, so everyone's gone over and gone, oh yeah, we need education, we need a school building, but there's no teachers, no books, no maintenance of the building, nothing like that to maintain it, so
the institutions.
So yeah, so they sort of come across a problem, and then, but it's not appropriate technology that's used to sort of solve the problem.
It's I was going to say, was it also a reaction against relativism? Because the implication is that once you got down to a thing that that it had a single meaning.
Yes. So a cup is a cup is a cup. But if you say the cup in Yoruba, I first came across this problem of the thing when I was learning Yoruba, which is a West African language, and to say the cup is sitting on the table in Yoruba is like to say it in English, you start with cup matter. So there are no adjectives in Yoruba actually, because everything is a sortal particular, not a spatio-temporal particular. So a cup is a spatio-temporal particular, but Yoruba life revolves around names for different sorts of matter. So cup matter, table matter, actually human matter and so on. So to say the cup's on the table, you have to say cup matter in the mode 1 manifests, and then you'll say table on. And in your matter, you use a suffix.
I'm not sure it's being ironic or not, but it seems that often, especially I'm interested in this, when you've got this concept of this universal language, I can't see how it can possibly be a universal language because they're just needing more and more objects. But to me, working interculturally, it's about trying to find, or very often you're trying to find meaning together or create new meaning together, which is a generative process. But I can't see how this is actually generative because they're just loading up their own packs with more and more stuff. There's no sense of creating something new together or creating meaning together and how you interpret that object or that object. And I'm thinking of the concept of metaphor, I guess, as well. So I'm not sure whether it's being ironic or whether it's just
I think they're saying that this is, if you treat this what they're doing seriously, this is exactly the problem. And there's no sign of exchange in there, right? It's just display.
No meaning making, it's just display. It's just
the irony in part, so there's the three professors sitting in consultation. You can imagine them trying to have the whatever the conversation might look like in terms of improving that of their own country, as they're just holding things up at each other, going and thinking that there's some kind of meaning being made there.
So can anybody translate what is being said in this?
Next thing, I have no idea what you're talking about. It's a flying pan.
I think it brings. Sorry. I think it brings it back to the discussion we were having before about whether it's objects or entities, and whether we can talk about the relationships. Am I able to speak?
Yes.
And so if you just have the objects, you can't talk about the relationships between the objects and the meaning, so you can't talk about meaning at all. And when you look at the text, he's done that in the text by capitalising all the objects. And so you can read through the text with just the capitals, where it's just school of languages, professors, consultation, project, polysyllables, verbs, participles, and you don't know what the relationship between all those objects are. So it just has actually no meaning rather than sharing meaning.
It dissolves into bits.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Peddlers, streets, and anything that is a spatio-temporal object, sometimes a named type of human, that gets capital.
But also inconvenience has a capital.
Yeah, I'd like to challenge him on that. I don't know how I do it.
The description of it as artificial converse reminds me of trying to teach vet courses. How push. And like there's these chunks that you really are supposed to communicate, but you have no way of knowing whether they have meant anything at all to people. And so you end up trying to invent a way to do that, and then you end up abandoning that and just returning to actions, that are enactments of the things that you're trying to communicate. So it just the clunkiness of this kind of discourse is very familiar.
Yes. Okay. So there's a lot of it around still.
Yeah. It's in fact it's increasing.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I agree with that too.
This is more like discussion as opposed to dialogue. To me, this is describing discussion where you're banging your idea across and not really listening to the other person's idea, and they're banging their idea across, as opposed to dialogue where you're trying to come up with some way of understanding each other and making good meaning together.
Yeah, I was trying to see what they're opposing. One man is opposing what looks like a frying pan, but who knows? Because it doesn't seem to speak to the object that's in the hand of the other man.
I got the sense, and I'm going to try my best to articulate this because I got really dumbfounded, and I was sitting there going, just, I had to read it a few times because there's so many layers of meaning in this that what I got from it was this really cheeky, ironic commentary about language at the time, because so much was going on, and they were, the way that the language was being used to define and describe and summarize and objectify and contain everything, because what was happening in terms of we were learning, we got so much knowledge, and they were learning so much relative to what they were going out and seeing around the world, with respect to the sophistication of their language to summarize and scientifically kind of contain everything. So this little cheeky comment of why don't we just use things, in one way it got me thinking about words and meaning making, but also talking about things as like you were saying, about creating something, communicating, instead of using this kind of language in this really defining and containing kind of way. It's almost as if he was suggesting that if you took that away and... So this is where it's getting hard for me to try and articulate what it was... that you could actually have that kind of creative language and interact with things in a different way, and then and show people through reenactments and kind of use that language in a different way. So rather than trying to contain things and describe and impose your own meaning on things, which is what was going on in the world at the time, with your language, to try and use their communication in a different way to generate something.
So you're contrasting an impulse to close things down, keep them orderly, neat, in their categories. You're contrasting that to a situation where words are allowed to be generative and to have effect, to make things become different. So, words are agents, or texts are agents. And clearly, he's by writing this in his ironic, satirical way, his expectation is that this text is going to do some agential work as words, as a thing, as a text. It's going to intervene. It's going to make a difference. So he's enacting a completely alternative view to this hold things down, contain things in their categories.
As Julie said, try something, create something new, try something different. And in a way, that kind of first suggestion of weighing yourself down with all these objects, but taking another perspective at it.
Yeah, I'm just seeing I'm just thinking what I said before is actually not right because and I'm saying that now they're actually trying to make meaning. Like they're not banging their ideas across, they're actually trying to find a way to. You could look at it as
So
trying.
that
I've got
needs
this
to start performing somehow, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they're like the other one's maybe trying to find something. That's a little bit like this, you know, and no, not quite that. It's a little bit like this, you know, without words, just until perhaps they're holding up two things that somehow transmit. That's taking it very seriously. Yeah, keep going.
I thought about children, young children communicate before they've got the words to do so, and they have that kind of conversation with each other and with others, with adults as well, so that they point and people around them understand what they're saying, but they also communicate with each other in that kind of way. Look what I've got. But also the title itself kind of says it, doesn't it? That could it be difficulty talking whilst holding on to an object, or could it be difficult conversing with an object? So.
I like the first sentence that sets a scene where professors in a school of language have given themselves a task to improve that of their own country. There's a total disconnect between their capacity to achieve their objective. And so they've restricted themselves to what they're familiar with, their objects, their instruments of governance, and they've come up with a dysfunctional solution because of their lack of capacity to think more broadly. That happens in government, so...
They don't get out enough. They should get out
more.
more.
They should be going to talk to the other faculties and say, what can you bring to this discussion?
Not to speak of the women.
So is that partly why that notion of improving that of their own country, immediately it's a critique. They're critiquing,
yes,
because that's what their goal is.
Yes.
And is that why it's the second? Partly why it's the second text in that huge catalogue, because it's a critique of critique, or it's a
and it's the hubris of the university too. I think that he's talking about that professors immediately assume that they're the ones that are going to be able to solve the problem. So altogether.
I think the reason that it gets recycled 300 years later, when as part of an exhibition that really is claiming we need to go beyond critique, that it's not enough for professors to sit in consultation on improving that of their own country. It's been made to do double work, I think, 300 years later, as somehow being made to critique itself. So it's a critique of critique. And is that critique?
When I looked at the picture, I'm not sure whether I'm taking it off on a different connection, but I looked at the man at the back, who's on his own, head down, with his burden, and the two at the front who are talking, but the two of them have similar hats, and I wondered whether there was something about the hat as an object that tells us something of difference between the two men in the front. The man standing up and the other one, he's got I was looking for things that indicated, objects that indicated a difference in their power and privilege, even though they're
They have a lot of the
possibly
same things.
headless. They do have a lot of the same things. Yeah.
To be in China, isn't it? I mean, the hat and the
And the Chinese writings.
Yeah.
Mind you, this wasn't made until 1894, that's 150 years later, so it's not really from the original. It's how somebody in Victorian England fantasised what Swift was meaning.
But even the fantasising involves putting objects in the picture to continue the critique.
Helen, do you know in the book that the maps, the book from the series that you
maps of territories.
Yeah. You know the story about the map, the true map that was as big as the world. Does that come from Gulliver's Travels?
No, that's Borges. That's 20th century.
Because that's the same idea, isn't it? That this person was, if you've got a true map, it's as big as the world.
Yes,
Playing with this same idea that something can represent something truly.
Yes. So it's this notion of representation and the simplistic idea that you've got a thing here, a cup, and the word cup is, if you like, somehow skyhooked onto the cup. And so, yes, okay, Yoruba might say one thing, Yoruma might talk about cups in another. But really, a cup is a cup is a cup. And that actually comes along with the assumption of the world is really matter set in space-time. And in a sort of almost magical way, as soon as you see that figure of matter set in space-time, which as Matt points out, it's very deeply embedded in cartography and, sailing out and the cartography or the cartographic imaginary, which has this notion of the map as a representation of the world here. As soon as you let go of that working imaginary or that figure, translating figure, well, things become very, very different. It becomes very hard, actually, to do this work. Putting them in their categories and getting them to stay there. And that's one of the functions, if you like, of this image of matter set in space-time. But yeah, that's exactly, it's a Borges story, written in the mid-20th century.
Okay.
I can't see the connection. I want to say a bit more about the whole notion of critique and how it depends upon a split between culture on one side and the material reality on the other, and the whole business of representation, and how it seems to me that Bruno Latour would have chosen this thing in a way to say, look, the scientists are still doing that. They're still thinking that objects and language is something there, and we need to sort of break down that sort of it seems like Swift is at the very beginning of that sort of enlightenment, and that's at the very end of it. And we need to just find a way of emphasising the materiality of language and the sort of political agency of objects. And at the same time, but what does that say about how critique has run out of steam? What does that mean?
Yes. Well, I'm not sure I know what it means. I'm suspicious of it, but I think that the notion of this representation, Swift being at the beginning of this enthusiasm for that there is, and we could know the world as a particular set of category, having come to its end. But the point is, it's not going to go away. It's deeply embedded, and we're going to have to live with it, and we're going to have to work out how to work around it, to subvert it, to oppose it sometimes, and so on. So
What's the it? The critique or the representationalism? Or
the representationalism.
Right, but aren't you saying that critique depends upon representation?
That's one way of one way of interpreting what Bruno's saying by when he says critique has run out of steam.
Yeah, that just reminds me of what Jenny was saying before about the art and representing somebody else's country, and how it just brings up all these becomes an ethical issue. And I guess that's the same with the goods and the bads.
Yes.
That as soon as the goods and bads start popping up or emerging, then you're really tied up in an ethical
and
dilemma.
you have to learn to name them and name them in generative ways and negotiate them.
Yeah.
Not just assume that they get the bads and we get the goods.
Just following on from that point, that possibly the end of critique is something about that we don't hold the judging observer in the same exalted position as we did in modernity. So that the climate change debate, as an example, is something that there's all of these people who are all privileged, who all know their instruments, who are telling us a story about the world, that a whole lot of people are just not buying anymore. That they're just saying, no, you might think that that's describing reality, but we disagree and we're going to play a completely different game. So that the sort of privileged place of that objective knowledge maker just doesn't hold anymore. It's much more political now, in a sense, and so that's the game we have to play. That it's not, you can't just go back and say, I'm from the university, I'm telling you the story about the way the world really is anymore, and so we can't get onto that privileged vantage point.
But are they saying we don't agree with your science, or we just don't care about your pretended authority?
They're saying, they might be saying both, and they probably say different things depending on which thing was being proposed.
I think this goes back to that article about new governmentalities. This morning while I was waiting for them to come and pick me up because the boys were ironing, I heard, I was reading a book called What Your Dog Knows, and apparently dogs suffer from a condition called neophilia, that they're always attracted to something new. And I was thinking, it's like, oh, there's so much critique going around, so I've got to find a new angle, so I'm going to be critical of the critique. So now I've got something new to say. I've got a commodity that I can sell in the academic world.
I think that as well, like, you remember, like, scientists weren't always valued, like, you know, back in the day, before really sort of the Industrial Revolution and everyone thought technology was great, like, they weren't really valued at all. They were sort of feared almost, like it took a long time for sort of scientific, like quite basic things that we take for granted now. Like, they weren't, you know, heroes or anything then, no one really listened to them then. And I think now as well, there's so, like, everyone's an expert in something, isn't there? Like, now you've got, because this is an exhibition of media as well, and now you've got so many blogs and you can Google anything and Google's got the answer, and you can look for what you want. So if Google gives you 3 answers, you choose the one that you like the best. So it's not as if, you know, it's, there are experts, but then, you know, everyone's got an opinion. And now, because I guess this was written when they were just making printing machines, so for the first time people could get their books out a lot easier, but now with the internet anyone can get, say, anything and, you know, reach people all around the world, everywhere. So I guess the critique, it's spread away from like the people the elite that used to do it. It's now sort of very general. Yeah, and there is still like, there's still your high-rated peer-reviewed journals. There's still, like your top journalists and things that will still be doing it to a very high standard. But then, if you don't agree with them, then you can just find someone else opinion on Google.
And if everybody can critique, and they do, well, it gets a bit scary when anybody can critique climate, the science of climate change, the claims of climate change. And I think that's one of the things that's a bit scary, that we have in general, it's hard to make a knowledge claim that is, it's as easy to make a critical knowledge claim about the facts of climate change, for example, and haven't believed.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of say like, who controls it all and who's got power, so if you want to get your thought across, then there's ways you can do it, like, you can high up the media and say things like that, and then that's got your point across. And I guess back in the day, people, it was a lot, the kings or whoever it was in power, they'd control, the media outlets, and if you lost the war, you didn't get your story out. And so, like history's always, I guess, been like that. That the winner always gets to tell the story.
It's more stories.
Yeah, and now it's just everyone's got lots of stories.
What about, say, Indigenous knowledge claims that have always just had to sit, well, not always, but they've sort of, for some time had to just sit where they are situated and are not necessarily recognised but continue to be there? Maybe as
and to be agential in place.
That's right. So that they're performing a certain role in a way, whether or not it's recognised, there they are, not going away.
They're recognised by the people who need to recognise them as knowledge claims.
Yes. I'm sorry, may not be recognised in some kind of overarching way. So this sense of parallel opinions and critiques is not new in that way. Those sorts of knowledge claims have been valued. But does it mean that we're learning to be a little bit more skillful about how to have things sit side by side?
Yes. Well, this in a way is what you're going to do when you introduce your object to each other. I was partly, by thinking out that exercise, I was partly inspired by this. Can you actually get beyond that in introducing your object to another person, getting the other person to appreciate your object and learn to respect your object, and hear the story that you're telling by which you met this object and appreciated it and its agency.
Is that getting beyond critique?
I think it is. Yes. And part of getting beyond critique is being explicit or know what you're doing in terms of how you're working in the collective.
I remember looking at that picture just after attending a local reference group meeting at Ramingining and thinking how there were a whole bunch of white, I guess, experts that had come to that community, and they were holding up their fry pan saying, and then somebody else was saying, no.
Like the fry pan was the security action plan, or the school attendance,
And they were kind of these mute objects, so they weren't really communicating a lot. But showing them.
But interestingly, and it's my object is that community reference group is that is this body to show the fry pans too. That somehow in showing those people the fry pans, that there's this message being communicated to all these other people through them.
Well, the irony was that they tended to be showing the fry pans to each other. I watched the body at that meeting. The Ballanders were talking to the other Ballanders, so that was really interesting.
Yeah, and then to get on a plane to go to Ramingining in order to get out there fry pans.
Might as well show your objects to someone who's more likely to understand them.
And appreciate them.
I wondered whether I wrote that why 300 years later, and I was reminded of Pine Addison again. Once I finally got through that article, it became like... Because she talks about escaping the dogma of agency, and it seems to me that that's partly why that still means anything today, that those objects, that's what Swift was talking about if he'd read Pine Addison, and what Pine Addison might say if she'd read Swift.
Would you like to talk a bit about Pine Addison?
Oh, well, I will prove that I don't. If I do, I will prove I don't actually. I still don't actually understand it. I was just taken in the last workshop with you about ethnography that Pine and reminded twice today about things that she wrote about that seemed to have some relevance today. One was that escaping, about agency and about the kind of the dogma of human personhood. So therefore, thinking of the non-human object or entity, but also that notion of the collective and the ensemble cast that work together in a generative way.
Yeah. So I'm often using the term participant, where she will use members of an ensemble cast. So Pine Addison is a feminist philosopher, and she's written about collectives and objects in this way. That was our reading for last year.
Just on the thing about the agency of the objects, I was reminded of yesterday when Anne was telling a story to us about the work that she's doing with Linda, who's unable to be here, with these clams or whatever were they clams, baby clams, and took them out to Goulburn Island to plant them for the Healthy Tucker program, and they all died on the way. And talking about it as a terrible tragedy, Helen was saying it's just the way that the world works. We just need to realise that the world unfolds as it does, and it's neither good nor bad, and we just need to see ourselves as part of that, reflecting on it rather than making judgments, saying it in the right sort of way. So just to think about the world as unfolding in its own particular way, neither good nor bad, helps us to see ourselves as in quite a different light, and the nature of critique in a different light, and the ethics of the objects, the way that the goods and the bads that come out, and the things that are actually negotiated by, in particular contexts, in very complex sort of ways.
Should we think like that in light of the Australian election that's coming up?
I think we're going to have to.
Because that was stepping away from agency that you have that perspective, because you're not assumed responsibility.
It's because you're stepping away from the agency of in the Cathy Edelson sort of point of view that it's all unfolding, and we need to be very careful about what we think are those agents that are working out in the world before we come along and start making decisions about them. We're actually making those things. And so the agency is actually in the creative process of us making decisions and solving the problem of how to go on together, rather than by thinking there's a thing out there that's got power over us and there's another thing over there in the climate and the clans as being all sort of pre-existent.
Which is also about moving beyond critique.
Yeah,
which is all about improving some imaginary future, but it's about just being in the moment of the emergent moment, the unfolding moment, and.
So when Helen's saying that the work is actually the work of what are we and what's our capacity, and that capacity is being commentators, and there is a sense in which the whole question of critique and the commentary is that complex relationship, and as long as we see the commentary as being generative rather than representational, and we keep working with it like that, then we're in a chance, we're in a better position to actually be generative in our writing.
So we start being almost like witnesses rather than commentators, and it's more about experiential being in the moment rather than trying to guide it necessarily.
Yeah, and really problematising what experience is. I think that's one of the really tricky issues that emerges once you take on this idea of we're all just there, and the world is happening along, and we're part of it.
I think already I'm starting to change what my object might be, but also the notion of how I even began thinking about the objects of governance, and reminded it subtly by you the other night, I think, Helen, where I think I began my story of object of governance by assuming, as I did in the introduction this morning, that something's happening to me, and that I'm assuming it's bad, rather than actually also working the other way, and working with other people to from the ground up as well. So there's something that's only just working forward, and it's not quite on my tongue yet, but it's something about this assumption. I had already had this assumption that it was objects of government was automatically something negative.
And it was coming downwards.
And it was coming downwards onto me. So yeah, I need to rethink all of that.
It seems really difficult to critique these days because everything's going so fast. It's like once something pops up and you think, well, you should find out what that's all about. And by the time you've found out, something else has taken over and its place anyway in this. So it's sort of like, I suppose, in this kind of context, where our critique is aimed at.
Yeah, and part of the idea of critique is that you've got a better view or a different view, or having this language gives you a better account to make a better future, or and the sense that I have to take time doing this, and whereas it's been intervention rather than critique, or insightful intervention on the basis of knowing the other participants that you're mucking around with, is a different form of doing, I suppose. We've been going an hour in this, talking about Swift. Have we finished talking about Swift? Do we want to talk more?
I just had one other thought. After getting this and reading it and being a little bit confused, I thought I'd go off and see if I could find the Making Things Public website thing, and I found it, the thing that Bruno Latour wrote. And there was something in that which I thought was quite interesting, comes out in this, is that notion of the assembly, so the notions of the spaces in which people meet to do their exchanging work. So Michael talked about the university as being one such thing, but as soon as people meet, they're meeting in a somewhere. So these blokes on this one are meeting out in the street by the looks of things. But how the space conditions and is actually another agent in terms of prescribing what kinds of work can go on in their halls. And so just in terms of thinking through my object, I was initially trying to work with that notion of space.
In terms of institutional space?
No, it actually grew out of when I was working in Balga, which is an Aboriginal community out in the Tanami Desert. There was a very interesting thing to my mind, anyway, always at work. If we were in the community and I was talking with old people or anybody really, but sort of some significant ones with some old people, that they would have a certain flavour in the community, and as soon as we went outside the community, the nature of the relationship and the nature of how things worked was just completely different. And so sort of becoming aware of, so that, the community space condition, a kind of relationship, and the being in the bush condition, a different kind of relationship. And when Michael and I were doing some of our housing interviews, we went to territory housing, and we went up in the lift, and we couldn't even get into the space because we didn't have a swiping card. And so, eventually we were trying to call people, and eventually somebody got out of the lift with a card, and we got into the building and we let in, and then we conduct our interview over the desk with things on the computer screen and just showed you saying, see, I've got this here and whatever. And then I went and did an interview in a town camp in Alice Springs, and drive off the bitumen onto the dirt, and there's puddles and grass and torn down fences and chip packets and no sign work and completely permeable in a very different sense. And just thinking, wow, the life of this thing that we're talking about, which is essentially the same object, was just, each of the different contexts into which I walked just created such different sets of possibilities. So that's not something that's sort of in there, but something that sits along with that, that it's not just the objects one might have in their bags, but the places in which we stop to put down our bags, or the halls in which we can go over and pull the fry pans off the shelf. But I thought it was too hard an object to nail down in the end, and so I went for something a little more tangible.
Well, on a similar thought, I was thinking about the agency of all the legs of the tables and chairs in this room, because they elevate us all to a certain level, but we're not on the floor, we're not on the ground, and we just take those, even little something like that, for granted. But in the situation where you were, the contrast was so great that it came home.
And the people within them, like it's only with the sort of benefit of some readings and hindsight and time that I thought, that's an interesting idea. But those people who work in those spaces, that's the space. So it ceases to, because they've got a SWAT card, it ceases to think about it in terms of who gets in and how do they get in and how do they have to behave once they're in, and all of those kinds of things.
Maybe I'll talk a bit about the text that, in the end, we want to come out of this workshop. What we're aiming for is a collection of narrative-type texts about objects of governance.
So narrative rather than descriptive. That's stories.
We're aiming at stories, but
Not so strict.
yes,
Okay.
yeah. But one of the reasons I'd like to aim for stories is because stories enables you to talk about practices and to see things in their contexts, which is one of the reasons that narratives are useful in that sense. That you're talking about the life of objects by default almost. Okay, so we hope to make a collection of texts from each one of us that is a narrative text of about 3,000 words. And they will be submitted to the journal.
Learning Communities
Journal. Thinking of us as a learning community, in other words, thinking of us as a collective. And that's one of the reasons I really like that journal, because it really emphasises teaching and learning and in collectives. So I asked you all to.
If you had the last one that we worked on, if you haven't seen it or heard of it, talk to me and I'll show you about it.
And this is by November, isn't it?
Yeah, we would like to have them by November, and then we'll put them together and do a bit of and sort of make them connect in some way, or perhaps make a few suggestions about them. And then, as a whole, it will go to a referee. So it will be a referee publication, a short referee publication.
And the referee might suggest that one paper or another not be included.
Yes, which we had in the last time we did this exercise. Okay, probably writing narrative is a different way for almost all of us to write, and it will take some time to write narratives about objects of governance, and we're quite happy to work with you in coming up with your 3,000 words. 3,000 word story about an object. And so, in a way, we've already begun the work of getting you to do that. We sort of upset things by sending some rather odd readings, and it's really, started. Each of you's already been disconcerted. So that's one of the ways of working here, is to sort of get things sort of out of order, get things disconcerted, get you disconcerted and most of you have sent the 3, and so then after that it's okay, work out what an object might be here, and many of you have already said, I started off with this idea and then I realised that's not going to work and I tried this one and so on. So many people have already been through several objects. Some of them just could not have their story told in this way. And then we got you to write your 300 words. So now, in a way, what I want you to do after lunch is do the next step, and without blushing and without insulting your object, respecting your object, introduce it in a respectful way to another person in a way, recognising that you and your object are both delegates, or both from another community, from another collective, working in this collective. Okay, so we all come along with our objects, which we're attempting to respect. But respect doesn't mean like. One of the objects that I've been working with a lot is ecosystem services. Now, ecosystem services, I think I'm allergic to it, actually, and that working with it is like living with a cat. For a person who's allergic to a cat, living with a cat. So you don't actually have to be fond of your object, but you do have to respect it. And one of the papers I wrote was really criticising a man who attempted to enumerate ecosystem services, because he didn't respect the object. He engaged in, I think, bad faith. So I discovered later that I accused the new professor of the biggest school of government in Australia of engaging with bad faith with respect to his object. He probably hasn't noticed. So it's it's an assembly process in a way that I'm trying to get you. So you're already involved in the work of getting these 3,000 words together.
Is the thing that unifies them the fact that we're all thinking about how as sort of professional writers or thinkers be attending to objects, how our ability to pay attention to objects is making a difference to the way in which we engage with our work?
Yes. So there's an element of reflexivity.
So that means that the stories really ought to have ourselves as characters?
I think so. But, I don't want to really be prescriptive.
No.
I couldn't do it without having a narrator in the text that is some version of this narrator in the body.
Right, but it could be a fictionalised
Yeah,
view.
that's right.
Yeah.
And in Science and African Logic, which I wrote about, grew out of my time in Nigeria, there's a sort of quite a well-developed figure in the text that bears. It's not. Figure in the text.
Very angry if they heard us talking about them or that in most particular ways. So I think when we talk about it, it's all sort of confidential, and we need to just let loose say what we think about what happened. But when we write it, it needs to be written in such a way that people will all be identified, and so that part of that fictionalising is a way of making a good story without embarrassing or making anybody angry.
You mean confidential and contained within the World Wide Web?
Yes.
Through the camera on the street.
Yes, and we need to be careful about what we say about people.
Yeah.
But it could, for example, I could imagine returning to Daily River.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
You'd use.
I guess that you'll probably answer this question over the next couple of days, but are our stories designed to open other people's eyes to the agency of objects, or are we just using that as a means to tell moral stories about how we should live?
Both and neither. I think it's a little more modest than that. I think it is learning ways to address objects and address others about objects that is respectful to the objects and the other persons. So, yeah, this learning how to write, I think, is the overwhelming hope.
I'm getting a sense of developing a sort of a sensitivity and a sensibility that I haven't really, perhaps, that I have an inkling of,
Yes.
but I haven't perhaps focused on. So focusing on that change in myself through sort of like seeing something by taking your eye off it. Like you know, Pleiades, when you can see it only by not looking at it because it's in your peripheral vision, and it's that sense that this writing the narrative is like not looking at what I want to look at, and through that I might see it somehow.
I feel as though I've missed a conversation about what a narrative and a story is that I might not need an answer to it, but it feels to me like it's...
What a narrative is in this context.
Yeah.
I want to maybe say Michael.
I immediately think of Matt and thinking it's got a beginning and a middle and an end. That's one of the things about a narrative.
Oh, but this is
I thought that was a story.
This is the conversation that emerged in that learning communities journal, wasn't it? From that previous issue?
Partly, yes. I mean, one of the issues, well, one of the techniques we used in the last time we did this was to differentiate between the author in the flesh and the author in the text as a way of getting people to feel much more comfortable with an author in the text, but who's not really exactly a version of the author in the flesh. So in other words, the representationalism is abandoned there as well. So this became a device, and the referee then said it's become, that device actually became too dominant, and the separation and the connection between author in the text and author in the flesh are really contingent and flexible and ambiguous, and I think that was a good comment, a good useful comment. I don't really make a difference between story and narrative. Should I? Do you think?
The way that the words were being used, I got the feeling there were some implicit assumptions about the difference between the two. And I always thought that a story did have a beginning, a middle, and an end, so I was thinking, well, what's a narrative then?
Yeah, I tend to use stories very generic sort of a term. I think theories are stories. So I tend to just use story, account, description, but narrative, I suppose by narrative, I think you do actually get to focus in on practice. practices, on collective practices more, whereas stories can just describe. Narratives almost always have you undoing categories a bit. Stories very often have you solidifying categories. So perhaps there is that.
Yeah, and maybe there's that element of, like the ethnographer trying to slavishly represent a reality out there in all its detail and faithfulness, rather than saying, we don't want to buy into that whole business of representation in the world out there. We're actually making a generative text, so we need to tell the truth. What were we saying the other day about him saying, I'm never going to tell a lie, but I'm always going to, I'm not going to promise to say the truth, I'm just going to promise not to tell a lie or whatever. So there's something about the creative work of making a narrative, which means that you're not actually trying to give a scientific story of what happened in the world out there. You're actually trying to tell a deeper, more general truth, and it's a creative and imaginative process. And it does mean sometimes fiddling with the times and the places and the people and changing names to protect the innocent. But that's the way of working towards the truth of the narrative. Maybe that's partly to do with the difference between a story and a narrative too.
And one of the interesting things that's happened, for me, that happened last year, was that the narratives had a beginning, middle and end, but not necessarily in that order.
Yes.
That's lovely. So it's a generative tool. It's as opposed to scientific writing, which is generative, but not in the same creative way that actually gets your imagination. It actually does something to your imagination. It starts you imagining things in a different way.
Yes. To me, just in my mind, in the story, I don't necessarily know anything about the writer, but a narrative implies to me a narrator, and that there'll be some hint or presence of the narrator in a narrative, whereas the story might be disembodied from the storyteller or the writer.
Yes, there's not necessarily a narrator in the text as a figure in the story.
But either of them could be valid approaches.
Yes, that's right. And I think one of the things I really want to take away from last year's effort is openness and trying not to get in this, groove of objects of governance and whatever.
Do a bit of a triple shift.
Yes. Okay, so I just said the 300 words, but writers, if you want to, what I hope is that you'll do a bit more writing, both after lunch, perhaps after you've tried to conjure up your object as a companion or as a familiar, orally. That you might do some writing, you might do some more writing tonight. And if you want to send it again, that's fine. But come tomorrow morning, maybe prepared to read a little text. That might be your opening paragraphs or whatever. So, and it could be the 300 words you've already said. If you're pleased with them after you look at them again after what we've done this morning. But it might be something different. So in other words, what we'll do first thing tomorrow morning is get the objects into the room as well.
Which may involve material objects as well.
It could, yeah.
And do you think it's an idea to people to make copies of what they've written for others, or not at this stage?
Well, I think you could if you wanted to.
we use this for images?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Do you want to? Yeah, Helen's always resists being told to tell people how to behave. So yeah, do what you like, basically. Do you think that we should all go off for a lunch and then come back and pick our partners? Or should we pick our partners now and go off and do it maybe over lunch?
Yeah, I think that might be a way to go.
Should we put the names with a hat or something? And everybody draw a name, or how do you want to do that? Do you want it random, or do you want us to?
Or people pick people who they think might be interested to talk to. Don't ask Helen to rule on that one. That's the last thing she's going to make rule on. I think you decide with your partner whether you want to come back after an hour and do your work, or whether you want to go off and have lunch together.